Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers. Back with me as ever, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And delighted to welcome returning guest, founder of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young.
Hello, Fraser.
Great for you to be here. Tom, do you want to tell us a bit about what we've got coming up? Our live event, for instance?
No, absolutely. So as we've been banging on about on the podcast for a few weeks now, in a couple of weekends' time, we are going to be at the Battle of Ideas Festival in Westminster on the 19th and the 20th of October. We've got a live edition of two of our podcasts. So the Spiked podcast, this show will be on the Sunday, on the 20th. We've got a great lineup of guests. Kathleen Stock, Graham Linehan and Rakib Assam will be joining me and Fraser for a live show. Also plenty of time for your questions as well. Do come along to that. Also on the Saturday, myself and Chris Snowden for our Last Orders podcast will be joined by Simon Evans, Julia Hartley-Brewer and Kate Andrews. So if you want to get your tickets, go to battleofideas.org.uk. You can get a ticket for the Saturday, the Sunday, or for both days if you want to see both shows. And if you're a Spiked supporter, listener, reader, you can get 20% off with the discount code SPIKED24, SPIKED 24. So please do come along.
Excellent. And we're still selling copies of
Absolutely.
Brendan O'Neill's brilliant book, After the Pogrom. Get it now. You can get it on Amazon. We've had some really bad, annoying issues on Amazon, but it's now available. And plus, you can also donate to get a signed copy. Do you want to explain how that works, Tom?
Yes, so while stocks last, if you donate £50 or more to Spiked, you can get a copy of this signed by Brendan himself, as well as to support all of the work that we do here. So yes, After the Pogrom, get it on Amazon or go to spiked-online.com/donate to get your signed copy.
And today we'll be discussing the anniversary of the 7th of October, the Tory leadership race, and the bald man who successfully sued for sex discrimination. So it's been a year since the 7th of October, the deadliest day for Jewry since the Holocaust. Tom, I mean, it's been a really bizarre and quite dark year. People didn't respond to this event in the way that you might hope. Mm-hmm. Some people outright celebrated it quite soon afterwards. Many people have downplayed it. Many people have sought to, in many ways, demonise Israel in the aftermath, and Jewish people as well.
No, absolutely. I think that's been reflected in a lot of the commemorations, actually. I mean, there have been some very powerful commemorative events. There was one in Hyde Park in London over the weekend where you saw a lot of Jews and Israelis and also just supporters of the Jewish state getting together to mark this horrendous anniversary. But on the other hand, you've also seen a load of events which seem to be almost ignoring the pogrom that started this whole conflict. And as you say, it's not only the most deadly assault on Jews since the Holocaust, it's also on a per capita basis the most deadly terror attack since 1970, since think tanks started collecting this kind of data, because Israel is such a small country. There was a think tank in the US which calculated that if you kind of scaled it up, it would be the equivalent of if 9/11 had claimed like 40,000 or 50,000 lives. This is such a tremendous moment of sort of national trauma, and for anyone who believes in humanity, frankly. And yet there has been a strange desire to shift the attention away from the event itself, to talk about everything that's happened since, and to obscure the remarkable barbarism and evil that was meted out on the people of southern Israel on that day. And I am sort of reminded of the immediate aftermath as well, because in the same way that the kind of pogrom has been forgotten, I also think the initial response to it has been forgotten. The fact that on our own streets we saw people driving around areas of London honking horns and basically celebrating what had taken place. The fact that a lot of the demonstrations began almost immediately after the pogrom itself. You know, there were people who were openly taken to the streets in celebration of what had happened, the murder of 1,200 people, many of them children, many of them women, the rape and the barbarism that was unleashed. And this was a point that the Community Security Trust pointed out in their report a few months ago. In terms of the spike in anti-Semitic incidents, which isn't just people saying horrible things on the internet. There was a 100% rise in anti-Semitic assaults that took place in the UK in the wake of October the 7th. That peaked in the couple of days after October the 7th.
Yeah.
Before the ground invasion into Gaza to deal with Hamas had begun, before any nonsense pretext that what we're here to protest about is against Israel rather than for Hamas.
Yeah.
And I think all of that has kind of been forgotten from our discussion about all this, although maybe we should have always expected that was going to be the case, given how much this sort of anti-Semitism and this anti-Israel bigotry had been building up over the course of the past few decades.
Definitely. And it is worth stressing the ground invasion of Gaza did not begin until late October. So any of the protests before then, any of the celebrations, any of the, demonstrations on the street were purely in reaction to the 7th of October, not to anything Israel had done. Toby, what have you made of this past year?
Well, it was obviously extremely shocking. And I think I perhaps naively hoped that more people would make common cause with the victims of what happened on October 7th than did. If you compare the reaction to October 7th to the reaction to the Charlie Hebdo massacres, they were universally condemned. Huge protesters came out onto the streets of Paris and elsewhere to express their solidarity with the murdered cartoonists and journalists. Macron was unequivocal. Well, it wouldn't have been Macron, would it? It would have been Sarkozy, but the French state was unequivocal in condemning what had happened and taking a stand against Islamist extremism. But the reaction to October 7th, even though it was actually a far worse act of terrorism, was much more muted. Macron recently condemned Israel's efforts to defend itself from Hezbollah and Iran. David Lammy has, restored the funding to the UN. What's it called?
UNRWA.
Yeah. The British government hasn't been nearly as unequivocal in condemning what happened, and I think the left generally has had its reaction has been really disappointing. It's as though the kind of toxicity of the woke left has been exposed for all to see, and yet it doesn't seem to. I hoped when that happened, again perhaps naively, that this would finally show people just how ugly the woke left is, that it could have such a blind spot about such an extraordinary act of barbarism, particularly when it included rape and sexual torture on a mass scale. I didn't expect the woke left, or I didn't expect people to, not notice that.
Yeah.
I thought, the world can now see just how morally bankrupt, the radical progressive left is. Their failure, their moral failure at this moment in history will expose them. All the kind of professors and student activists celebrating the pogrom. You would have thought that would have alienated some of their, less thoughtful or more thoughtful student followers. But no, it doesn't seem to have had that effect at all. It just seems to have kind of polarized things even more. People's positions are dictated by kind of where they are on these kind of cultural issues. I just hope that it would have cut through all that, but it didn't.
Yeah, it should have been a mask-off moment, and I think it showed where the sort of politics of identity leads, certainly the sort of identitarian hierarchy leads, where automatically, there's this we've tried to place almost US-style race politics on the Israel-Palestine conflict, where even Hamas are seen as victims just purely because of the colour of their skin. It's completely bizarre.
No, absolutely. And also an incredibly simplistic but also phony sort of anti-imperialism which had developed on sections of the left, which essentially saw any blow against the sort of hegemonic Western powers, as it were, even in the form of plucky little Israel, as a benefit, as a positive, even if it came in the form of rape and murder of civilians. It really did, as you say, kind of pulled the mask off. And I think it's worth remembering, like there were people taking to social media saying that this was a day of celebration. The Socialist Workers' Party, the newspaper of the Socialist Worker, the newspaper of the Socialist Workers' Party here in the UK, sort of Trotskyist dreg that still hangs around, printed a story, opinion piece, it was either the day after or 2 days after October the 7th, saying rejoice, quite openly. They were holding demonstrations, handing out placards to people. People were chanting Allahu Akbar. It was so blatant. Then you had the people who maybe are a little bit more, have one toe in the mainstream, the kind of leftish commentariat, shall we say, who I really thought at least some of those people would be forced to reassess. I always thought that like the Iron Dome almost was like the best thing that ever happened to them, because it kind of protected them from the consequences of their own demented support for Hamas. As long as it was just a few rockets that were intercepted, as long as it was a few kind of low-level terror attacks, which, whilst despicable and horrendous, were not the sort of thing that made a lot of news in the UK or in the US, that it kind of stopped them from having to face the full consequences of their support for these groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. The fact that it wasn't that long ago that the Labour Party was being led by a man who called both of those groups not only his friends, but also to say that they were a force for political justice and social justice in the Middle East and in the region. I thought that at that point, in which you saw what Hamas was really about, that what they said in their founding charter about delighting and luxuriating in the murder of Jews was actually real. Yeah. That they would have to be some kind of mea culpa. There would have to be some kind of reassessment. There wasn't, and that's actually where I think the denialism crept in. I wrote about this on the site this week. It's something which has been one of the really troubling responses to October the 7th, which is the attempt to downplay the atrocities, to demand either, unless you can show me a high-def snuff film, I'm not going to believe that these things have happened. It doesn't matter how many eyewitnesses or how much evidence you have. And I think that in part, there's some people who are denying it because they're racist scumbags. There's a lot of them who are denying it because I think they can't really face up to the fact of how wrong they were. Yeah. But it still ends up with a really toxic mix and shows how morally depraved this section of politics has become. This section of politics that was supposed to be anti-fascist, anti-racist and all the rest of it, and yet has become allied with and an apologist for the most fascistic, racist group you could ever possibly imagine to come across of.
It's I mean, in a sense, to condemn the left's willful blindness, or the woke left's willful blindness about what happened on October 7th, to condemn it as kind of morally depraved is slightly simplistic. I mean, there is an attempt to cling on to some kind of morality, which is why the way they've dealt with it is through a kind of combination of denialism and cognitive dissonance. So the cognitive dissonance has been sort of off the charts, as kind of encapsulated by Queers for Palestine. But also the denialism. People out on the streets on the pro-Palestinian protests, I think, have genuinely persuaded themselves that the events as described, as depicted on film, as celebrated by Hamas, didn't actually happen. That actually most people at the Nova Music Festival were killed by the IDF. It's a kind of desperate attempt to kind of cling to the moral high ground, kind of absolutely kind of mind-boggling denial of reality and just kind of extraordinary cognitive dissonance. I mean, these people even claiming that Israel is somehow the embodiment of white supremacy, when, not all Israelis are white or of European descent. Most aren't. To just dismiss Israel as a colonialist project or as kind of, a manifestation of Western colonialism, when actually, the Jews were there first. But just at every level, the cognitive dissonance, the denialism, you'd think at some point the kind of mental strain would be too much, but it doesn't appear to be.
It's amazing how much they can withstand. And I think that's one thing which, in a way, the sort of responses from the woke left, regrettably, were ones that we had come to expect to a certain degree. I mean, if you think about the building left anti-Semitism, the apologism for Islamist anti-Semitism, the lack of interest in any of those issues, the fact that there were, you would see time and again kind of stories. There's a Jewish cemetery in Kent which was desecrated. I think it was like a number of times in the course of a decade. It just didn't really make the news. Like, people were not interested in it. Even the supposed dogged anti-racist. The one thing I found almost more dispiriting is how the sort of mid-wit centrist media position, the position of a James O'Brien, the position of a Gary Lineker, these aren't thinking people by any stretch of the imagination, but still, the fact that even they feel that the high status opinion in elite circles has been to be increasingly anti-Israel, to not recognise the sickness at the heart of Hamas and Islamism and so on, to believe a lot of the propaganda which has been pumped out. In some ways, that's more dispiriting. We already knew that the Corbynistas, shall we say, were down this rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But the fact that it's become the water that the cultural elites swim in more broadly, that was already kind of in the offing. But I think it was really cemented over the course of the past. Of the past year, and that is almost worse in some respects because of the fact that the Corbynistas they have a lot of cultural influence, but also they're ultimately irrelevant in a lot of respects.
Well, isn't the midwit centrist take that Hamas, Hezbollah, Israel, they're morally equivalent? You have to condemn both sides, and you have to say we need a two-state solution or a ceasefire, but to morally not distinguish between the IDF and Hamas.
Or Israel's slightly worse. I think, if you take Gary Lineker's the Hamas thing quote as emblematic, it's like, yeah, of course there was some bad, but really, everything that's happened since October 7th is so much worse, I think is their kind of take on it.
No, absolutely. And I think it feels like there's a shift that was taking place and just a lack of appreciation of what we're talking about here. What began this conflict, this horrendous... It was a proto-genocidal act. I mean, for all this talk, all this nonsense talk about what's going on in Gaza being a genocide rather than a war in which tragically civilians get caught in the crossfire. That attack was specifically designed to evoke Jewish people and Israelis' worst nightmares, going kibbutz to kibbutz, house to house, no level of barbarism or depravity off the table. It was essentially tried to say you should still be afraid. The whole point that you founded this state for is still... you're still not safe. The lack of appreciation of that a year on, what it meant, why it needed it made clear that Israel couldn't coexist with Hamas. All of that is gone, and the moral failure on the part of the cultural establishment broadly, the political elites to a certain extent, really shouldn't escape us. And I feel like they have evaded responsibility for the way they've responded to all of this.
Do you think that the reason so many people have kind of turned away from the barbarism of Hamas and seem so determined to hold Israel to a much higher standard than other neighbouring countries in the region? Everything we've seen that we've been complaining about, do you think that that's prompted primarily by anti-Semitism, albeit anti-Semitism which conceals itself from those in the grip of it? Or do you think it's prompted more by just a kind of self-loathing, a hatred of Western civilization?
I think there's certainly enough of both. I think there's an element in which you have, first of all, if you've got people, as happened remember when the IDF was going through that process of literally having to hold screenings of the atrocities that took place on October the 7th, just to try to convince people that it actually happened, despite all of the documentary evidence, despite the fact that social media was flooded with these snuff videos, despite the fact that you had the BBC, the New York Times, even the UN hardly tends to take the Israeli line on matters, to put it lightly, saying that these atrocities, these rapes, these murders took place. The fact they had to hold these screenings. There was one in Los Angeles, it was protested against.
Yeah.
Even presenting this. And I think if you're in a situation where you're standing outside of a movie theatre saying that any depiction of Jewish suffering is Israeli propaganda, you've left the realm of anything else and just ended up in anti-Semitism. I think the problem is that the anti-Semitism and the anti-Westernism have kind of been bound up with each other as well. There is a kind of sense that this sort of profound geopolitical bigotry of low expectations, this kind of sense that it is only the supposed Western or Western-backed powers that have any agency on the world stage, that therefore even if you're an Islamist terrorist butchering people and raping people, that you kind of know not what you do because the global hegemonic Western empire is the only actor in this situation, has fed and created a kind of seedbed for all of this stuff. But I feel like it does feel like we're splitting hairs a little bit when you've got people complaining or eye-rolling or virulently rejecting the very existence of Jewish and Israeli suffering on October the 7th as anything other than anti-Semitism. However they got there is an interesting question, but it doesn't change the fact of where they've ended up is anti-Semitism, I suppose.
Okay, let's talk a bit about the Tory leadership race. A surprise outcome, weirdly, because a lot of people were predicting that James Cleverly was going to come on top on the basis of an earlier vote. But we've got Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick. Toby, what have you made of the latest developments?
Well, I mean, I'm not particularly close to it, but as I understand it, there are two theories as to why James Cleverly was the front runner one moment and came third the next. One theory is that the Jenrick camp lent votes to the Cleverly camp. Although I can't now remember exactly what the kind of motivation for that was. They wanted Cleverly to come first, maybe in the hope that that would mean Tugendhat would be eliminated. I can't remember now. The other theory, which is slightly more credible, is that the Cleverly camp wanted Kemi Badenoch to be eliminated because they thought she would be harder to defeat in the runoff than Robert Jenrick. So they lent some votes to Jenrick, not realising that they didn't have any votes to lend, and therefore ended up eliminating themselves. And the kind of fall guy is Grant Shapps, who, even though he lost his seat at the election, is Mr. Spreadsheet, and had supposedly been running James Cleverly's campaign, and whose spreadsheet turned out to be not terribly reliable because he thought they had kind of more votes to spare than they really did. I mean, it may well be that that we're kind of reading too much into what went on, and perhaps when Tory MPs kind of thought about it quite carefully and thought, crikey, the biggest reason we lost the election and the biggest threat to our regaining power is the number of votes we lost to reform. If we just go for a candidate who is essentially the continuity candidate, that's not going to win back those reform voters. Someone like Jenrick or Badenoch, for all my reservations about them, I'm speaking now with the voice of a centrist Tory MP, they would be one of them would be more likely to win back those reform defectors than James Cleverly. So it was nice to flirt with the idea of having this Mr. Normal leading the party, but in reality, we need a right-wing headbanger.
I mean, the Tory party lost 7 million votes in between 2019 and 2024. That's, half of their vote share. About a third of those, lost Tories went to reform. Another third stayed at home. It did seem a bit to stretch credibility. I'm not saying that, the Tory right has all or any of the answers to their predicaments, but it did stretch credibility to say that actually what we need is continuity Rishi to go back to the thing that so manifestly failed. But that's their comfort zone in a way.
Well, that's their answer to everything. That's the sort of media class's answer to absolutely everything. I mean, I even think that the way in which they talk about the centrist candidate is a really misleading. It's a really misleading category in all of this. First of all, because it's something where I often think, like James Cleverly, if this leadership race was a few years ago, he'd be dismissed as a Boris Johnson loyalist and a lunatic. It's just because of on the spectrum of what is in front of them that supposedly he was the one that Starmer was really terrified of. But also, if you think about where actually the centre, roughly speaking, where British public opinion is, this isn't a very original point. They're concerned about immigration. They think the asylum system is nonsense. To the extent that they're aware of this woke stuff, they really don't like it. And within a very short space of time, they've realised that Keir Starmer is a complete mess. That is the antithesis of our media class. And yet these are the people who believe that they can almost act as the kingmakers, or at least people should listen to their advice when they offer their pointers on who should be their next leader. So, I mean, it did come about by potentially some sort of chicanery that backfired. I think a lot of Tory MPs, they think they're playing like 4D chess when they struggle with a game of Buckaroo most of the time. And I think this is another example of that. But at the same time, the idea that ending up in the final two with two politicians whose primary issues are ECHR, immigration, wokeness, and those kinds of issues is somehow an unpalatable offer for the electorate. Suggests they haven't really been properly speaking to the electorate very much.
Definitely. There's a part of me, maybe I'm being a bit too conspiratorial here, but there's a part of me that thinks that some of Cleverly's quite well-known gaffes would have been retread a lot more if he was seen as a candidate of the right rather than bizarrely, as you say, a candidate of the centre. I mean, quite famously, he liked to joke about what was it? Spiking his wife's drinks. My favourite joke, of course, was when he told a colleague in the publishing industry that she accused him of flirting with him. He said, "If I were flirting with you right now, love, you would be foaming at the gash." Now, I reckon that would have come up if Cleverly was seen as the unpalatable candidate,
or endear him to that.
We need someone who's to the lad contingent.
Yeah, exactly. Go to the lad vote. That's what you know. You'd have dapper laughs on side. That's
Yeah.
that's what
I'm Team Kenny rather than Team Jenrick.
Yeah.
Partly because I've known her for many years. I first got to know her when she was when she worked at the Spectator, and I was I think in charge of the Spectator supplements, and we wanted to kind of give them a much better online presence, and she was in charge of kind of IT at the Spectator back then. So we worked together quite closely, developing those websites, and then followed her political career quite closely as a consequence, and have always thought that she has great conservative instincts. And unlike Jenrick, I can attest to the fact that she has been a properly right-wing conservative for decades, whereas him maybe less than a year.
do you buy the conversion, the Damascene conversion that seems to have taken place on his part? Because you hear mixed things.
Yeah,
from people who've been in
I mean,
and
it's
around
always
sort
hard
of
to tell,
politics.
isn't it?
Vice signalling.
Yeah.
That's how I call it.
I mean, politicians are always a mixture of kind of sincerity and Machiavellian calculation, and it's often, and people like to kind of put them in one camp or another. Thatcher in the conviction camp, Boris in the kind of fickle Machiavellian floppy trolley camp. But actually, in my experience, they're always kind of it's always a kind of fluid combination of the two. So I'm not sure that that's the kind of big question when it comes to Jenrick. I mean, I think that the case for Jenrick is that he might make a better fist of winning back some of those reform voters, particularly as he's made cutting immigration his big issue and wants to come out of wants to repeal the Human Rights Act, whereas Kemi's been more equivocal about that. So that's sort of he might appeal more to those reform defectors. But on the other hand, I think Kemi would do a better job of getting Conservative defectors in general to take another look at the Conservative Party. She's a startling, surprising enough choice as Conservative leader, and different enough from everything that's come before, I think, to make people give the Tory party a second look. Whereas Jenrick seems like a kind of identikit Tory, white boy leader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's worth saying they didn't just lose votes to Reform, of course. They lost some to Labour, a small amount to the Lib Dems, and also a lot to the SOFA, as it turns out. So it's not just purely about winning back those Reform voters, I suppose.
And if you think about who would give Starmer a tougher time at PMQs, I think, I can imagine Kemi kind of beating him up every Wednesday. I'm sure Jenrick would do a perfectly serviceable job, but I don't think he'd be quite as brutal or as sadistic as Kemi. For pure entertainment value, I think it'll be more fun to watch Kemi beating up on men every week.
You could say also that she's someone who is effective in government, I guess, especially in terms of some of these culture war issues that she is particularly taking an interest in, as opposed to Jenrick, who merely resigned when he couldn't get, what he wanted. I mean, think of some of the changes around, trans. A lot of that comes from Kemi Badenoch.
Yep.
She was meeting with detransitioners when she was told she was specifically not allowed to by the civil service. So there's it feels like more of a track record, more of a basis than as you said, as we've been talking about, Damascene conversion, as Rob Jenkins.
Yeah, and I think because she's a black woman, that gives her a kind of authority and credibility when it comes to a lot of those culture war issues that Jenrick wouldn't have. She's really good at taking the moral high ground, at saying to white saviour types, don't speak on my behalf.
Yeah.
That's I think attacking the radical progressive left from the moral high ground seems to really wrong foot them. Make them really uncomfortable in a way that attacking them head on doesn't. So I think she'd be better, certainly, at winning those culture war battles than Jenrick.
And finally, let's talk about the bizarre case of a man who has won his sex discrimination claim. So this was an electrician. He was having an argument with his supervisor on the shop floor in a warehouse. The supervisor calls him a bald cunt. There was basically the case has gone back and forth in the courts. Finally, it's been decided by a learned judge that to call a man bald is sex discrimination because men are much more likely to be bald than women. Toby, where do you stand on this, speaking as a Well, can I, as a B word, I don't know if I can say it.
I feel like I guess Kemi must when white saviors are talking, sort of portraying black women as being these put upon victims with no agency. I don't want an employment tribunal panel to stand up for me as a bald man and protect my rights. I feel perfectly capable of doing that myself. No, it does seem pretty silly and hard to think of bald men as a kind of beleaguered victim group who kind of join the ranks of the protected. I mean, good God.
Where's your parade?
I think it's the hirsute that deserve the protection of the Equality Act. The amount of hair washing they have to do, the expense of getting your hair cut, hairs kind of get stuck everywhere, it blocks up sinks. It's them I feel sorry for. It's them that need the full protection of the law.
I'm getting inspired to go on a march now.
Bold and proud.
Reading the news reports, this was fascinating because you essentially had first of all a tribunal and then eventually a high court judge in effect having to wrestle with these absurd arguments. So one of the ones that was being mounted by the defence, by presumably the employer in this situation, was that, well, women can be bald as well. So they were having to weigh up the significance of this. And, and then at one point, another argument that was made was by the victor in this particular case, by the gentleman who has been sexually discriminated against in question, was that it's the same thing. Someone calling you a bald cunt is the same thing as talking about a female colleague's breasts. And then the judge having to say, yes, I suppose you're right. So, it just shows you how absurd this has become and how... from what is supposedly presented as harassment, has basically just become a way to weaponise whatever unpleasant conversation has happened in the workplace and just think, I can use that to get... Because it wasn't the only matter in this whole criminal proceedings. It was unfair dismissal. It was all these different components. But it just... You end up with a situation in which you have... an individual pretending to be incredibly victimised by something you probably brushed off 30 seconds afterwards, and also a high court judge having to take all of these things desperately seriously. But that's where we've ended up, unfortunately.
I mean, one of the things we've discovered at the Free Speech Union is that the Equality Act can be invoked to protect free speech. People think of it as the enemy of free speech, and for the most part it is. But in some regards, it's also the friend of free speech. So the classic example is Maya Forstater successfully arguing that her gender-critical beliefs should be protected under the Equality Act, and therefore to dismiss her for expressing them is unlawful discrimination. And more and more philosophical beliefs are getting designated protected status. So veganism now is a protected belief, a belief in democratic socialism, not a belief in conservatism, but we're working on that. And in one case, we're arguing that a belief in free speech should be a protected belief, because that then opens the door to protecting people who get into trouble for exercising their right to free speech. They could say, well, I said this thing because I'm a great believer in free speech. And you can see how kind of as more and more characteristics, beliefs become protected and everyone can claim to be a victim, in a sense you go through a kind of a looking glass in which nobody's a victim anymore. If everyone's a victim, then nobody's a victim. So maybe that's, rather than try and repeal the Equality Act, maybe the way is just to kind of push it to kind of this kind of absurd lengths. So everything becomes protected, everyone's a victim, and therefore nothing's protected and no one's a victim.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.